Welcome. We're going to take a quick run through some information on the Western frontier. And we're going to thank, of course, Miss Susan Pojer from Horace Greeley High School for making such a wonderful PowerPoint. So let's get right to it. We're going to go through this in about 15 minutes, so let's make this nice and quick. All right, some of the essential questions. What national issues emerged in the process of closing the frontier? Why does the West hold such an important place in American imagination? And in what ways did the West romanticize or become romanticized in American culture? We're going to keep these issues in mind, okay? When we talk about national issues, we specifically are referring to economic, social, political, and cultural ones. And the American imagination and American culture is something that many Americans are familiar with, but still to this day, the premise is that the West holds an important draw on our cultural identity. So let's take a look at some of the factors that influence the development of the West. So we have some key tensions. Clearly, the main tension is Native Americans. Not just versus buffalo hunters, railroads, and the U.S. government, but the Native Americans for self-preservation. One of the tensions existed was their ability to try and survive. Cattlemen obviously were fighting for land versus sheep herders and ranchers versus farmers. Um, we also see that there are tensions in the West between ethnic minorities, specifically the Mexicans and Chinese and Japanese, as well, of course, as Native Americans, and those Americans who saw themselves as nativists, as being more pure American than others, not inclusionary. We see that there are the beginnings of environmentalists who want to preserve the land before it's completely taken over by big businesses, interests, as well as corrupt government officials, farmers, and buffalo hunters. And finally, we have the last tension, which is this sense of lawlessness on the frontier versus the missionary and economic influences that are pushing up against them. So let's jump right in to the railroads. So we see here that railroad construction takes place in the West during this period, and if you look at the scale here, specifically with this pinkish area that surrounds each of these railroad lines, or most of the railroad lines, those are federal grants of land that's given to railroad companies for every mile of track that they lay. It's kind of a big, huge financial incentive in order to get private companies to build these railroads so that they can be used for the national good. But if you really think about it, most of the people that derive their living from the areas near the railroads themselves are farmers and cattle herders, and they have to buy or lease land from the railroads. That has a big influence and impact on the development of the West from an economic and a demographic point of view. All right, these are some of the people here who made millions of dollars. We see here at Promontory Point in Utah, one of the most famous photos in American history. We see the laying of the Golden Spike, which is the convergence of the eastern and western lines, creating the very first transcontinental railroad in the world, actually. And you had two different railroad companies kind of like building these railroads from the east to the west. Okay, and they finally met right over here. Okay, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific. So let's get on to the cowboys. We see very famous pictures of cowboys riding free, taming the wild animals. But the truth of cowboy existence was that it was very hard work for little pay, and of course many of them are landless. So we see here that one of the most important developments in the exploration and settling of the West is the Colt 45 revolver. It was one of the first times that guns were able to shoot multiple rounds without reloading, and that transformed not only combat against Native Americans, but this sense of every man being their own personal army. As a result, we see that some of these people, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and others are wanted for robberies that they commit. Trains, of course, present very interesting targets, just as the Spanish and Portuguese fleets did when they were filled with Incan and Aztec gold and silver. We see here that some men began to take the law into their own hands. Mining, of course, was one of the biggest impacts, economic impacts in the area if you were trying to strike gold. The reality, though, is that most people on their own, individually looking in mountain ranges and in mountain rivers, found nothing. And so they began to fall victim to many of these different people who were trying to make as much money off of them as possible. Most of the mining centers here, if you take a look, in the West are silver and gold mining. Okay, most of the iron ore is in Pennsylvania, and of course coal mining at that point was still in the Ohio River Valley area. Since the late 1800s, mining has developed quite a bit in that area. But in order to take a lot of this land, many corporations were founded that hired people in order to do all of the heavy work for little or no pay. The Anaconda Company was one of the first that actually struck it rich with a silver mining operation. Of course, when the mines depleted, many of the areas became desolate, economically desolate, and so there were ghost towns. Now, I told you that earlier that one of the tensions for land use was between cattle men and sheep herders. These, of course, are people who are in direct contrast to the cowboys, in that they derive their land, their economic impact from the land itself, and not from the resources or goods that can be taken from it. Cattle herders used to take the cattle from low-range grazing areas and up into the railroad stops where they could be shipped off and sent up to be slaughtered for hamburger and steak and other foods. Okay, but of course, sheep herders found themselves, able to adapt to many different environments, and we see here that even though cattle takes over much of the West, that there is the development of sheep herding specifically in Eastern Oregon and Western Idaho. But there's much more to the use of the lands than just cattle and sheep herding, and that includes the steel plow that helped produce much of the Great Plains and transform it from a grassland into a wheat land. Of course, people needed fresh water, and prairie fans were very important for doing that. Barbed wire was one of the most simple but ingenious inventions that transformed the West, in that it allowed people to enclose property without wood or access to wood. We see here that yes, cattle herders would kill sheep and sheep herders would kill cattle. As far as the distribution of population and minority population in the West, we see here that as far as the West is concerned, the percentage of whites as a native part of that population is relatively small, whereas it is much larger in the North and even in the South. We see here that by 1900, 80% of the population living west of the Mississippi was Native Americans, of course, and Chinese and Japanese Americans. Specifically, they had a large percentage of the population, of their population in the West. Not the West as a whole, but of their entire population. Many African Americans, specifically after the Civil War, decided to try their hand at homesteading. Of course, we know that the Homestead Act in 1862 created a vast exodus of people moving out west in order to try and transform the land, and by doing so they could get a lot of land very cheaply. If we take a look here at African Americans moving west, we see that as a percentage of the population, there is a heavy growth, okay, specifically in these areas. And if you look at the years, you see that by 1890, many of these states see the population rise quite a bit, even though these population graphs are of different numbers. We know that many African Americans served in the American military out in the West. Of course, they were called the Buffalo Soldiers because they were segregated. And they were given often jobs of fighting Native Americans, even though they had a romanticized, not they, but others had a romanticized view of the racial segregation that existed in the West. The truth is that many Buffalo Soldiers served in tough, difficult campaigns for little or no recognition. If you take a look here, you can see in the key that these little cannons, these purple cannons, are military forts that were set up in the West in order to prevent and protect the economic and population trends that were rising in this period. Of course, you can also see here the existence of Indian Territory, and that was where Native Americans were put after they were moved to off the reservations. We see that there is a great deal of discrimination in the West, specifically as more Japanese and Chinese begin to come in. You see that in that political cartoon here as an opposed position where whites seem to do whatever they want to Chinese Americans. Of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 bans the immigration of Chinese and limits it actually to just under 100 people per year, which is ridiculous. In China, of course, there was massive war, civil war going on, and that is known as the Taipei Rebellion. There was also street fighting, riots that broke out, race riots over Chinese and African American people. Now, if we take a look at the Chinese and African American population, you see here almost a flip-flop of the two, where there is a large African American population, there is a relatively small Chinese population. The same is true as you move further and further east. Of course, as you go further west, you see that transformation take place. Now, people who were farming were able to use this land. If you notice, this green area right here is roughly the 98th meridian. It's a designation where the climate changes in the United States, and that's where the Great Plains actually begin. So there's a heavy degree of rainfall and water over here. Over here, not so much until you hit the Rocky Mountains. We'll see here that homesteads from public lands does grow a great deal during the 1890 period. Of course, after the Native Americans have been removed from the West as a military threat and as an economic form of competition, we see that homestead lands rise greatly. This is true also in 1887, especially after Native Americans have been moved off their land. We'll talk a little bit more about that. If you take a look at this picture, you see that survival in the West for many Americans meant that there is a tough existence. Many Americans lived in sod houses, which were built out of mud and clay and dirt. And this is an example of a sod house right here. The tough existence. Here is also a map of the climate, as you see how the American West becomes more and more arid. In 1893, famous American historian decided to conclude in his famous thesis that there was no more West, and by 1893 the frontier was ended. Okay, we see also others who try and reclaim it. And this person, Francis Newlands, was a congressman who helped support the irrigation of arid lands in the West through federal support. But really, the main issue in the story of the West is that of Native Americans, and we'll only touch upon this a little bit. We'll pick up on this a little bit more in the next screencast. It's important to note, while we're wrapping up this first session on the West PowerPoint, that the two treaties here that are important in establishing this perimeter of Western expansion is the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, and also the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, and to a lesser extent the Medicine Lodge Creek Treaty of 1867. These treaties gave the U.S. government the premise that they could acquire land in exchange for goods. And of course, the Civil War changes some of that in the first treaty, and afterwards, more land is lost.